I'm disciplined, so I'll talk about what I was asked to talk about, which is Iraq and the connection between Iraq and the so-called war on terror. There is a connection. It's pretty thin, but it's been drawn. Intelligence agencies have pointed out that they can't detect any real connection between Iraq and the terrorist networks, Al-Qaeda and the rest, which isn't too surprising. But there is a connection, nevertheless, and it's been pointed out. Namely, we can create a link if we want. And the best way to create the link would be by attacking Iraq. It's expected widely that if we do attack Iraq, that's very likely to ignite terrorist attacks, maybe that are already being planned as a possible deterrent. And it's very likely to spawn a new generation of terrorists who will be seeking revenge and also deterrence. And the deterrence is not a slight matter. Those of you who've been following the international relations literature, I'm going to be very establishment in this talk. I'm only going to quote people right in the mainstream. People who've been following it know that leading scholars, respected figures in international relations, have been pointing out for some time, in fact, well before Bush, that U.S. adventurism is stimulating a proliferation of weapons of mass destruction as a deterrent. That's not just countries that are being specifically targeted for attack, but others who are concerned about deterring a state that seeks, I'm quoting now, unilateral world domination through absolute military superiority and is becoming a menace to itself and the world under a radical nationalist leadership. I've been quoting Kenneth Waltz, a well-known figure in international relations, and Anatol Yevin, who's the senior associate of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. In fact, even real hardliners are expressing pretty serious concerns. So one of the leading military and strategic analysts who's concerned primarily with the Middle East, Anthony Cordesman, who's about as hard line as you can get within anything that might be called the spectrum of sanity. He's been he warned recently against what he called the neoconservative fantasies of the sillier armchair strategists and their plans for reconstructing the Middle East and maybe the world. He was referring to Richard Pearl and Douglas Feist, but that also includes Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, others, who all happen to be very close to the extreme right wing in Israel. So you're getting quite a lot of clear and good reporting from the mainstream Israeli press about them. As maybe you know, Richard Pearl, who's very close to the center of planning now, and Douglas Feist were writing position papers for Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's new foreign minister, who's well to the right of Ariel Sharon. So they were doing that in the 1990s, and that's their connections and contacts. And it's not understandable that even a hardline military analyst like Cordesman is worried about their sillier proposals, which are in fact being thought about and may be implemented. Why? That's about the only connection I know of between Iraq and terrorism at the moment. We can stimulate terrorism if we really intend to. So why Iraq? I mean, obviously not in order to stimulate terrorism. Well, before going into that, begin with a kind of a truism, which should be unnecessary to mention. In the case of either the threat of or resort to violence, the burden of proof is always on those who advocate it. So that's true whether it's domestic abuse or international affairs. And it's a heavy burden. Maybe there's an argument for it, but it's those who advocate force and violence who have to bear the burden, and it's a heavy one. You never need any arguments against the use of violence. That's automatic. You need an argument for it. It has to be a very strong one. That should be obvious, and I'll just put it in back. So why do they want to do it? Well, just to simplify, since time's brief, I'll pick two views that are expressed pretty prominently in the mainstream, and I'll quote mainstream analysts. So here's the first interpretation. I'll start with Yusuf Ibrahim in the International Herald Tribune a couple of days ago. He's a senior fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations and was a senior Middle East correspondent for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal for about 30 years. So very recently moved to the CFR recently. His interpretation is that the goals of the Bush administration are basically two. One, gaining short-term political advantage, and two, I'm quoting him now, turning Iraq into a private American oil pumping station. Well, there's a counter-argument to that, against that in the New York Times yesterday, maybe a response to it, I don't know, by Serge Schmemann, who argues that kind of disparages the oil relationship on the grounds that there's not going to be an instant bonanza for Iraqi oil. It's true, but it's not a very persuasive argument. I mean, by the same argument, you can prove that nobody was interested in Iraqi oil 80 years ago, or Texas oil, or Saudi Arabian oil, or Venezuelan oil, or certainly not Alaskan or North Sea oil. I mean, really expensive to get at. So by that argument, yeah, it's true, you're not going to get billions of dollars tomorrow, and it'll take development funds. But the argument is very weak. In fact, much weaker in the case of Iraqi oil, which is vast and relatively easily accessible, than it was in numerous other cases. So I think we can dismiss the counter-argument. Which was, I think, a front-page story in the Times Week in Review yesterday. Well, that's Yusuf Ibrahim. Yevon, who I quoted before, has a more detailed analysis along the same lines. He suggests that the Bush administration, the political aspect, is following, I'm quoting him, the classic modern strategy of an endangered right-wing oligarchy, which is to divert mass discontent into nationalism, inspired by fear of enemies about to destroy us. And he speaks for many people in the world when he regards that as the U.S. government's policies now as a menace to itself, meaning the country, and to the world. Well, September 11th provided a pretext for resort to force, not just for the United States. That's worldwide, and it was predicted at once. So the Russians in Chechnya, the Chinese against their Western minorities, Indonesia and Aceh, Israel in the occupied territories, I mean, all over the world, repressive governments that were engaged in violent repression used September 11th as a pretext to intensify it under the guise of a war on terror, and assuming correctly that they'd get a nod of approval from the boss in Washington. And it's not too surprising that the U.S. itself would adopt the same idea. So yes, 9/11 was a pretext, and it was also used as a pretext to discipline populations throughout the world, again, under the guise of a war on terror. And that ranges from the Central Asian dictatorships all the way over to the more democratic countries, including our own. So the fact that September 11th would prove a pretext for a war in Iraq is not a great surprise. And in fact, this was pointed out also to pursue the domestic political agenda, as Yevon points out. It's natural for an endangered right-wing oligarchy to do that, especially when it's carrying out quite an extensive attack against the domestic population. It's not a big secret, or it shouldn't be. In the U.S., that was pointed out right away for example, by Paul Krugman and one of his well-known economists in one of his regular New York Times columns, who reported right away that literally before the dust had settled over the World Trade Center ruins, influential Republicans signaled that they were determined to use terrorism as an excuse to pursue a radical right-wing agenda. And he and others have been documenting how they've been following that course ever since. Again, shouldn't be a secret, so I won't pursue it. The Beast of Baghdad was then brought in to be an even more terrifying threat, and there are also independent reasons. There is a long-standing goal. Ibrahim and others are surely correct, and it's kind of obvious. It's been a long-standing goal to restore to U.S. control the second largest oil reserves in the world. It's been recognized ever since the mid-40s, just quote the State Department in 1945, that this is a major component of what they called a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history, and a major theme of U.S. foreign policy since the Second World War has been to make sure that the U.S. Dominates it. France was expelled on the interesting grounds that it was an enemy state since it had been occupied by Germany, so therefore its contracts were void, and England was slowly reduced to what the Foreign Office calls, British Foreign Office calls a junior partner. The U.S. puts it differently. 40 years ago, a senior statesman, probably Dean Acheson, in internal discussion described Britain as our lieutenant. The fashionable word is partner. And they like to hear the fashionable word, but the reality is the actual word. And control over Middle East oil has been a very large part of it from the Second World War. Let me stress that it's control, it's not access. There's a lot of confusion about that. The United States really doesn't care much about access to Middle East oil. From up until 1970, didn't care at all. North America was the biggest producer, but it didn't affect the need to control the region. Since then, the biggest importer has usually been Venezuela. If you look at U.S. intelligence projections, for example, the National Intelligence Council projections for the next 15 years, they predict and suggest that the U.S. should rely on a more secure Atlantic basin resources, West Africa and Latin America. But that has absolutely nothing to do with control over Middle East oil. Now, that has to do with its being one of the greatest material prizes in world history, which means that whoever controls it and can have an effect on setting price and production levels can also determine that the wealth, vast amount of the wealth, flows right back here, and it does. It's independent of access to oil. A stupendous source of strategic power has nothing to do with access. That translates as a lever of world control. And that's been recognized clearly since the 1940s, and it remains true today. Well, September 11th gave a pretext. The domestic politics affects the timing, and the strategy has been working quite brilliantly. You see it right now in the midterm elections. It's going to be even more important next year, presumably. If you put yourselves in, say, Karl Rove's shoes, Bush's campaign manager, when the presidential campaign begins in a little over a year, do you really want people to be thinking about what's happening to their pension or how they're going to take care of their elderly mother, or what about their job, or why can't they get health care? What about an environment that their children might live in? Things like that are certainly not what they want people to be paying attention to. They'll want people to be, singing praises to the brave cowboy who saved them from destruction at the hands of a colossal foe, sort of Martian foe, and will by then be marching on to some new adventure. Exactly as Given says, that's the tradition, that's the classic strategy of an endangered right-wing oligarchy, which wants to divert mass content, which has plenty of ground, into nationalism and fear. And it takes a lot of work to overlook the fact that the only people who are afraid of Condoleezza Rice's mushroom cloud, which is going to consume us imminently, the only people who are afraid of it are Americans, not the people of the region, for example. I mean, they're afraid, but they're afraid of the United States more than they are of Iraq. Of course, Iraqis are afraid of Saddam Hussein, and they have every right to be. But that can't possibly be the reason for the U.S. war. I mean, the U.S. was supporting Saddam right through his worst atrocities, helping him develop weapons of mass destruction right up to the day of the invasion of Kuwait. And it's the same people who are running Washington right now. So whatever the reasons are, it's not that. So yeah, they're afraid of Saddam Hussein, but they also know that he can't do very much. In fact, very little. If he made a move anywhere, Iraq would be obliterated. He knows that, and the people in the region know that. But even the U.S. press, the national press, which is usually highly supportive of power, now recognizes that, quoting, "the world is more concerned about the unbridled use of American power than it is about the threat posed by Saddam Hussein." It's a lead story in the Christian Science Monitor a couple days ago, and it's been pointed out by others. So there definitely is a security issue. There's a problem of securing the agenda of the radical right-wing oligarchy and making sure that they can continue for another 4 years to undermine living standards, destroy social policy, concentrate wealth in a very narrow sector of an unusually corrupt part of the business establishment, as Krugman and many others have been pointing out. And to pursue that, to secure that agenda is very serious. And it is a security problem, and that's about the only security problem anyone can seem to conjure up. But it's real, of course. Well, that's one interpretation. One interpretation, well, within the mainstream establishment, is what I just said. There's a long-term goal of regaining control over the second largest resources in the Middle East and ensuring domination of one of the greatest material prizes in world history and a stupendous source of strategic power. September 11th gave a pretext, as it gave a pretext around the world, for intensification of violence and disciplining of populations. And domestic considerations and that very important security problem, they probably account for the timing. So it has to be this winter, not next winter. That'll be too late. By then we'll have been consumed by the mushroom cloud, which will avoid everyone else but hit us. And of course, it's just kind of like an accident that'll be right in the middle of the presidential campaign, just as it's an accident that the people of the region are afraid, but mostly of us, and joining much of the world in that. Well, that's one interpretation. Incidentally, all of this is not only the classic strategy of an endangered right-wing oligarchy under a radical nationalist leadership, as Levin points out, but it's also second nature to the people in Washington. Remember that the people running the show are recycled Reaganites, right? Almost entirely. They come out of the Reagan administration when they were doing precisely the same thing. I mean, the first thing, when they came into office, when the Reagan administration came into office in 1981, first thing it did was declare a war on terror with pretty much the same rhetoric as today. At that time, Americans had to be terrified by Libyan hitmen who were wandering the streets of Washington, planning to kill our leader, another brave cowboy, who was hiding in the White House surrounded by tanks. I mean, if you're old enough, you'll remember that, or your parents will. That was 20 years ago. And they had to be worried about the Sandinistas, who were only 2 days marching time from Texas, the brave cowboy told us, and they were following the script of Mein Kampf in their plan to conquer the hemisphere, if not beyond. That was George Shultz, the administration moderate, the Colin Powell of the day. And there was a national emergency called, renewed every year because of the threat to the U.S. Security and survival posed by people like that, for example, by Gaddafi, who was planning to expel America from the world, according to Reagan, or at least his speechwriters. And people were afraid. I mean, this is traditionally a very frightened society. You can ask about the reasons, but it's well known. Americans happen to be more frightened of almost anything than most other people. all kind of historical reasons, but it's clearly true. That can be crime, aliens, drugs, you name it. There's a lot of fear. It's not hard to stir up fear among the population, and it was going on right through the 80s. So all of this is absolutely second nature to the guys making policy today, and it wouldn't be too surprising if that's what they're planning. Well, my time's just about running out, which is fine, because there is another view, which I can fortunately skip since there's no time, and that's what you hear every time George Bush or Tony Blair or someone who supports them reads from their note cards or maybe makes it up themselves. We can, and you're familiar with that, so I don't have to repeat it. Just end with this. We could run through the arguments. I don't know if it's necessary, but more interesting in a way is just to accept all the claims as true. So let's say everything they say is true. Okay, if you can, then you can run a little experiment. It's pretty easy to show that if the claims are true, there are very simple ways to meet the announced goals. I'm not just talking about sending back inspectors. There are other ways if you decide that a war is necessary. Measures that really haven't been considered. Kind of instructive to ask why, but I'll stop there since time's running out.
What concrete steps would you advocate the United States do as a superpower to combat terrorism, besides nothing?
Right. Well, first of all, one easy way to reduce terrorism, the easiest possible way, is to stop participating in it. That already reduces it by a very substantial factor. Huge, in fact, right up to the present. I'll give you, if you don't know examples, I'll be glad to list them for you. Second, to talk about that much smaller category of terrorism that's directed against the West, okay, and it exists and it's serious, say Al-Qaeda-style terrorism. Well, of course, one way to to reduce it is to stop fostering it. So remember where these groups came from. These are the groups that were organized, trained, and armed by the CIA back in the 1980s and their associates to fulfill for reasons of state. They didn't care about Afghanistan. As late as 1993, after the first attempt to blow up the World Trade Center, which came awful close to succeeding, Bill Clinton was sending Al-Qaeda members, or at least Afghanis, Islamic radicals from Afghanistan, along with Hezbollah people, flying them to Bosnia to fight the U.S. side in that war. Well, that one way to, and we can go on with that. Bali bombing is another case if you want to look at it closely. So another way to reduce terrorism is to stop fostering and organizing terrorists around the world. But let's take the attacks against the United States, okay, like 9/11. How do you deal with that? Well, one way of dealing it is by bombing Afghanistan, which, as far as anyone, according to U.S. intelligence at least, had almost no effect on terrorism and may have extended it. That's U.S. intelligence. There are ways, however, to reduce threats like that, and we know what they are. They've been carried out for careful police work. So, for example, primarily in Germany, which is the leader in this, police work has, in fact, broken up very significant Al-Qaeda rings. And yeah, that's the way you deal with crimes. The other way you deal with them, and everyone knows this, is by looking at the grievances. You want to deal with terrorism, every serious scholar, the head of every intelligence agency, anyone who has their head screwed on, knows that you do with it by looking at where it comes from. If you want, I can quote for you the head of Israeli Shabak and the head of Israeli military intelligence and leading scholars here and so on. Yeah, they all say the same thing, just as Britain finally found out. You want to deal with IRA terrorism. There's no use, wouldn't do any good to bomb Belfast or to bomb Boston, for example, where the financing came from. What made sense, first they tried violence, that just increased the terrorism. Finally, they started paying some attention to the grievances, which are quite real. And there's been some progress, and that's true all over. So yeah, there are a lot of ways to deal with terrorism, but the main way is to stop participating in it. This gentleman right here.
I've been reading a number of articles on this question of whether we ought to go to war or not, and I read a piece that said that Hussein has gone into the north and executed a lot of the Kurdish folks that are up there, and that commits genocide up there, and that the link to terrorism resides with the fact that he gives $25,000 to the families of suicide bombers, so that there's a monetary link there. You're asking about a connection. It's those two that he's broken United Nations resolutions, undermined international law, and that the war with Iran and Kuwait, that he's destabilized the region, and that it's
I'm familiar with the arguments
for war.
So what is the question?
But
what does one say about those things? Okay. So let's go through them. So it's perfectly true. Let's go back to the main arguments that are given. I mean, every speech of Blair and Bush and the British dossier, or let's take the New York Times a couple of days ago, which had a big insert taken from the Kennedy School, incidentally, from a Kennedy School research project on crimes of Saddam Hussein. And what was charged is all correct. Only one thing is missing in all of these accusations. 3 little words: with our support. Okay? Yeah, he invaded Iraq. He used chemical weapons in the war. He used gas against what's called his own people. The Kurds are his own people in the sense that the Cherokees were Andrew Jackson's people. But yeah, he used gas against the Kurds. He then carried out the Anfal massacre, which maybe killed 100,000 of them or so, always with the firm support of the United States and Britain. Okay? In fact, of the people who are now in charge, who don't even have the minimal decency to say, well, we did something wrong. What they do is leave out the words "with our support," and everyone who reports it leaves out the words "with our support," which continued, including giving him means to develop weapons of mass destruction, missiles, nuclear weapons, biological and chemical weapons, and all that went on literally up to the day of the invasion of Kuwait. And in fact, he did invade Kuwait when he was a U.S. ally, just as he invaded Iran when he was a U.S. ally. So yeah, he committed all of those crimes, and those are by far the worst crimes in his record, with our support. The next worst crimes on his record are in March 1991, after the war, right? After the Gulf War, when there was a Shiite uprising, which probably would have overthrown him. There were rebelling Iraqi generals who didn't ask the U.S. for support. Remember, that's the time when the U.S. had total control of the region. Total. It's after the war. But the people who are now in Washington decided to support their old friend Saddam. So they refused to allow rebelling Iraqi generals access to captured arms. They authorized Saddam to use military helicopters and other weapons, and he killed tens of thousands of more people while they watched. And they had a reason, an official reason. They said the reason is because we need what's called stability. We want to make sure that Iraq doesn't break up. It was explained rather well by the chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, well and approvingly, Thomas Friedman. He said, the best of all worlds for the United States would be an iron-fisted military junta ruling Iraq the same way Saddam did, but with a different name, because this one's kind of embarrassing. And those are his worst crimes by far. Did he violate UN resolutions? Sure. He's hardly the only one. Actually, people point out correctly that Israel's violated many more, but that's missing the point. If Iraq had think for a minute, if Iraq had the capacity to veto Security Council resolutions, it wouldn't be in violation of any of them. I mean, the main way to violate Security Council resolutions is to veto them. And who's in the lead in vetoing Security Council resolutions? Ever since the UN fell out of control with decolonization, so say since the 1960s. Well, the U.S. is far in the lead, Britain second, nobody else is even in shouting distance. And it's on all kinds of issues. So, for example, the U.S. is the only country on record as vetoing a resolution calling on all states to observe international law. Okay, that was after the U.S. had rejected the World Port ruling ordering it to stop its terrorist attacks against Nicaragua. So yeah, there are plenty of countries that are in violation of Security Council resolutions. That's true. Does it have anything to do with attack on Iraq? No, nothing. Let me just add one word, because I forgot to talk about the alleged $25,000 to suicide bombers. That may or may not be true. I've never seen a source for it, but let's say it's true. Before there were any suicide bombers, it was also reported by the same sources that Saddam Hussein was giving $10,000 to the families of anyone who was killed by Israeli atrocities. And there were plenty of them. Well, should he have been doing that? So let's take, say, the first month of the current Intifada. I'm just relying now on IDF sources, Israeli army sources. What they say is that in the first few days of the Intifada, the Israeli army fired 1 million bullets. Okay? One of the high military officers said that means 1 bullet for every child. Within the first month of the Intifada, they killed about 70 people, okay, using U.S. helicopters. And in fact, Clinton shipped new helicopters to Israel as soon as they started using them against civilians. That's just the first month. And at that point, and it goes on, no suicide bombers. At the time, it was reported that Saddam Hussein was giving $10,000 to every family. Well, is that supporting terror? I mean, it seems to me sending helicopters to Israel when they're using them to attack apartment complexes, that's supporting terror.
The question I have is, I'd like to know what your thoughts are on the long-term consequences for Arab cohesion and identity in the aftermath.
Sorry, I didn't catch it. The long-term consequences?
Of Arab cohesion and identity in the aftermath of a war or further an occupation, a long-term occupation of Iraq. As an Arab, this concerns me because I'd like to know what consideration is being given, if any, to preserving the identity and strengthening the nationalism in a post-war region.
You're speaking of Iraq specifically, or the Arab world?
Start with the people that are going to get occupied.
Well, you know, it's anybody's guess. I mean, once you start a war, you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, there's plenty of historical evidence on that. The CIA doesn't know, Rumsfeld doesn't know, I don't know, nobody knows. You unleash a major war, all kinds of things can happen. If we look at the historical record for a guide, we know what the U.S. record has been, not only in the Middle East, but right close to home, Latin America. We've got, as I quoted the Kennedy administration declassified record, we've got a policy of 150 years. And we can look at what that's done. So we can take a look, say, at the country that has had the most, has been the beneficiary, let's say, of the most U.S. intervention in the 20th century, ever since Woodrow Wilson invaded, namely Haiti, which is the poorest country in the hemisphere. And that goes, the intervention goes right through the 90s, supporting terror. In fact, a leading terrorist is now hiding out in Queens, and the U.S. won't extradite him. Emmanuel Constant, head of the group that killed maybe 4,000 people in the early 90s, and everyone knows why they won't extradite him. He's going to spill the beans on U.S. involvement with the terrorist forces. So that's Haiti, the most intervention. The second most intervention in the 20th century has been Nicaragua, which is now the second poorest country in the hemisphere. Vying with it in second place is Guatemala, which is also vying in second place for most intervention. And we can run through the record. In the Middle East, we have a long record. So in fact, again, the declassified record is extremely illuminating. And it, again, takes some discipline not to look at it. So George Bush, you remember his plaintive question, why do they hate us, because we're so good, and so on and so forth. He wasn't the first president to ask that question. That was raised by President Eisenhower in 1958 in internal discussion, where he discussed with his staff what he called the campaign of hatred against us by the people in the Arab world. And the National Security Council gave an analysis of it, gave a reasonable answer. They said it's based on the recognition. I'm mixing up a couple of things from 1958. They're not day after day. In 1958, the National Security Council pointed out, discussed what they called the recognition in the Arab world that the United States supports harsh and oppressive regimes and blocks democracy and development because of our interest in controlling Near East oil. And they recommended more of the same. And it continues right up to the present. We don't have a declassified record from last year, but we have a public record. So after September 11th, some of the better journals, like the Wall Street Journal, to their credit, did try to do some studies of opinions of the parts of the Arab world that they care about, the rich people. So they had a study of what they called moneyed Muslims, meaning bankers and lawyers and managers of multinationals and so on, all people who are right involved in the whole American system, no objections to US-style globalization or anything else. And they gave the same answers as in 1958. They said, yeah, we admire the United States, we like its values, we love its freedom, but we wish you wouldn't deprive us of them. What we oppose is the US policies of supporting oppressive and brutal governments and blocking democracy and development. I mean, that's now exacerbated by particular policies that didn't exist in the 1950s, but those are constant strains. And you hear it right now in Pakistan, Egypt, anywhere you look, same complaints. So is that a basis for thinking that the democracy is going to be established? Well, again, you can believe in religious conversion and have blind faith in your leaders, but other than that, I don't see any basis.
That's this gentleman right here. You made an interesting point in your talk, which is that the real reason we're going into Iraq, or the administration wants to go to Iraq, is to get the oil. That's this biggest material prize that exists in the world. And I tend to agree with you. I think that
one of the biggest material prizes.
One of the biggest.
In world history, yeah. That's the State Department, incidentally. That's not me. Yeah.
So if you accept that to be true, which I do, isn't there a certain calculus that someone who's sitting in the shoes of a Condoleezza Rice could make, that they're responsible for the best outcome for American citizens, and there's an upside of going into Iraq, which is we get this greatest material possession, one of the greatest material possessions in the world history, and there are downsides, which are we upset the international community, and maybe there's more terrorism. And couldn't you envision a calculus where they say, sure, that's the reason, and it's a good reason, let's do it. What's the flaw in the calculus?
Oh, I think that's exactly their calculus. But then we ought to just be honest and say, look, we're a bunch of Nazis. So fine, let's just drop all the discussion. We save a lot of trees, and we can throw out the newspapers and most of the scholarly literature, and just come out straight and tell the truth. Say we'll do whatever we want because we think we're going to gain by it. And incidentally, it's not American citizens who will gain. They don't gain by this. It's narrow sectors of power, domestic power, that the administration is serving with quite unusual dedication. Yeah, they'll gain. So, Dick Cheney will gain, Halliburton will gain, so on and so forth. American high-tech industry will gain. So, for example, one of the ways of recycling petrodollars is selling arms. Now, that's misleadingly called the military-industrial complex, but anybody who looks carefully, certainly anybody who works at MIT, where it pays our salaries, knows perfectly well that the military system is kind of a cover for high-tech industry. I mean, anyone who's using a computer or telecommunications or the internet or, gets benefits from automation or containerization or you just name it. I mean, a lot of it's coming out of the state sector of the economy, which is very dynamic and innovative. And it operates under the cover of military spending quite often. So there's kind of gains that sort of dribble down. But if that's what we're interested in, fine, let's just say it instead of all the lying.
Could you please discuss the doctrine of Pax Americana as an organizing principle for U.S. foreign policy?
Well, you're referring, for example, to the National Security Strategy report from a month ago. It was a pretty brazen statement, and it's part of the reason why much of the world, including Europe, regards the United States as a menace to itself and the world. It frightened the Europeans and others. On the other hand, if you think about it, Colin Powell pointed out in a press conference right afterwards that it wasn't all that new, and that even the preemptive strike doctrine, he said, was not all that new, and he was correct. It's an old principle. And the U.S. didn't invent it, of course. It's just the U.S. is by far the most powerful state, so when it proposes it, it means something. But you can trace it right back to the time when the U.S. became a major global power after the Second World War. Before that, it was also true, but in the region. That's called the Monroe Doctrine, in fact. It goes back to the, in fact, when Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, 40 years ago, ordered his staff to unleash the terrors of the earth against Cuba, escalating an already ongoing international terrorist campaign. The reason was that, you can read it in the declassified record now, the reason was that the very existence of the Castro regime was a successful defiance of the United States and of a policy of 150 years that the United States had been following. Namely, it was the existence of a regime which was not following U.S. orders. And they traced it back 150 years, so therefore we had to carry out a major terrorist campaign that goes right into the 1990s. So yeah, Colin Powell's correct. It's not new. And furthermore, it's even on the public record. You don't have to go to the declassified record. So if we go back again 40 years, since I'm talking about the Kennedy School, to the Kennedy administration, in 1962, 62 or 63, right about then, 62, I think, senior statesman and Dean Acheson, and senior Kennedy advisor, gave an important speech to the American Society of International Law. He was talking about the U.S. Economic warfare against Cuba, which was widely recognized as illegal, and by now every relevant body, including even the normally compliant Organization of American States, has declared it to be illegal. At the time, the terrorist war was already underway, but it wasn't that public, except, of course, Cubans who knew all about it. But what he told the American Society of International Law, that in the case of a U.S. response, he said that no legal, I'm quoting it now, no legal issue arises, no legal issue, in the case of a U.S. response to a challenge to its power, position, or prestige. Okay, that actually goes beyond the Bush doctrine announced a month ago, and that's the other end of the spectrum. That's the Kennedy administration. Okay, and that was public, like it's not secret. It's the American Society of International Law, and there are plenty of examples in between. The same is true of preemptive strikes. So the idea of a preemptive nuclear strike, which was kind of announced, you know, not in those words, but everyone understands it in the so-called Bush doctrine. It's also a Clinton doctrine. Have a look at the major study of Clinton's Strategic Command, which is from 1995. It's called Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrence, partially declassified. It's the major document sort of working out a post-Cold War strategy. Well, one of the things it advocates is what it calls preemptive response. It's a nice phrase. You know, think about it. Preemptive response, including nuclear weapons, against non-nuclear states that have signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, if considered necessary. Okay? It also explains the background. It says we have to convey a national persona of being irrational and vindictive. That, they say, will frighten people. In the professional literature of political science and international relations, is a term for it. It's called establishing credibility. That's very important. You've got to establish credibility. You know, you want to know what that means, ask your neighborhood and mafia don. Explain to you what it means. You don't just collect protection money from somebody if they don't pay. You certainly don't ask for a court order for it. What you do is beat them to a pulp. That establishes credibility. Then others know who's boss. And that's the way international relations work, too. So yeah, there's a direct precedent there, and you can trace it back quite far.
I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and ask the last question. If you believed that Saddam Hussein had biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons and was imminently going to use them, perhaps not on us, but on his neighbors, and with the potential of killing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, would there be any circumstances that you would agree that it would be worthwhile for the U.S. to use military force against him? Nobody in the region is worried about it. Isn't that a little surprising? I mean, Kuwait and Iran, for example, both of them invaded by Saddam when he was our ally. They're not calling for the use of military force. In fact, they're opposing it. The only country in the region that's calling for military force is Israel, and they have their own reasons.
The only people who seem to be afraid of this possibility, in fact, even Israeli military intelligence, the head of Israeli military intelligence recently announced that he doesn't, and they watch it pretty closely, that they don't see any nuclear threat from Iraq, maybe 4 or 5 years from now, but not in the near future. I'm strongly opposed to allowing Iraq to develop nuclear weapons. That's why when George Bush and number one and his cohorts were providing assistance to Saddam in developing nuclear weapons, I was writing against it and opposing it. Give you the citations if you want. That's 1990, 1998, 1989, 1988. Yeah, I was strongly opposing the U.S. and British efforts at the time to provide Saddam with the means of developing weapons of mass destruction. It was horrifying. And I certainly wouldn't want it to happen now. And if we're interested in stopping it, yeah, everybody knows the way. You get inspectors back. It's certainly for nuclear weapons that's going to work, maybe not for everything else. But just think for a second. Suppose I had nuclear weapons in my backyard, for instance. Would it be a threat to anyone? Or would it be a deterrent? Well, only under one condition, that I let people know I had them. Okay? If they're hidden in my garage, they're neither a threat nor a deterrent, right? Everybody knows this. If Saddam Hussein, in the extremely unlikely contingency that he'll develop nuclear weapons, if they were to be usable for anything, he'd have to let people know he had them. Well, the minute there's a hint that he has them, Iraq gets obliterated. Okay? Suppose there was any move made towards using them. Well, they get obliterated squared. That's why the people in the region, apart from not believing it, aren't afraid of it, and why they're afraid of the United States. There are reasons for, there are plenty of things to be worried about. So, for example, loose nukes getting into the hands of terrorists, that's a problem. And it's not a new one. That predates September 11th. As I mentioned, you can read technical papers in the literature, for example, in the journal International Security, 4 or 5 years ago, pointing out that, I'm sort of quoting, close to quoting now, that this is way before 9/11, that actually citing government studies, which show that, which conclude that a well-planned effort to smuggle weapons of mass destruction, meaning nuclear weapons, into the United States would have a 90% probability of success, far higher than any missile attack with or without national missile defense. That's like 4 or 5 years ago. If you want a guidebook for terrorists, one was published about 4 years ago by MIT Press called America's Achilles Heel by 3 well-known strategic analysts who pointed out all kinds of ways in which terrorists could, people with my limited capacity could carry out major terrorist attacks in the United States. Those things are really problems. And they're not new. I mean, we've all known about them since 1993, at least. And remember, in 1993, the offshoots of the groups that were organized by the U.S. in Afghanistan in the 80s almost blew up the World Trade Center. Plus the FBI building, plus the UN buildings, plus the tunnels under the river. They had ambitious plans. According to the World Trade Center building engineers, if they had a little better planning, they would have killed tens of thousands of people. These are not new threats, I mean, it's been known by everyone for years. All you have to do is read the newspapers to know it. If you read the technical literature, it's been all over. Those are problems. And if we're serious about trying to prevent, say, nuclear explosions in New York, the way you do it is by going after the loose nuke problem. And we know where the problem lies. It lies in the former Soviet Union and in Pakistan and in other places where there's very weak supervision over nuclear weapons. Are we doing anything about it? No, virtually nothing. I mean, very limited funding to try to do something about it. The latest treaty, so-called, which isn't really a treaty, it's a memorandum of understanding between Russia and the United States on nuclear weapons, it does nothing. It doesn't even reduce the number of nuclear weapons below the level that was already planned, and it provides for no supervision. Same is true of biological weapons. So, for example, just October 23rd, like just a week ago, the First Committee of the United Nations, which is basically the General Assembly, passed 2 resolutions. One resolution calling for reaffirmation of the 1925 Geneva Convention opposing the use of, banning the use of chemical weapons, and the second was effectively reaffirmation of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which bans the placing weapons in outer space, which we'll sooner or later call nuclear weapons. Passed almost unanimously, 2 countries opposed, the United States and Israel. The U.S. Carried out its opposition the way it usually does in these committees, but disarmament committees, by abstaining. And a U.S. abstention, like a veto, is in fact a double veto. For one thing, it kills the proposal, and for another thing, it bans it from access to the public. So there wasn't a single mention of this in any newspaper in the United States. A friend did a database search, which is normal. That's the way it usually works, on the assumption, I guess, that it's not a good idea to let citizens know of what's being done to end biology's only experiment with higher intelligence. This goes on all the time. But those are real threats. I mean, if we oppose, just shortly before that, the U.S. opposed any steps, even 10 years in the future, to add some enforcement devices to the biological weapons treaty that the U.S. at the last minute refused to endorse. Yeah, those are real threats. You know, we want to do something about them. Yeah, put teeth in them. And carry out our responsibilities under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which we signed. The Non-Proliferation Treaty commits those who have nuclear weapons to good faith efforts to get rid of them. Okay? Yeah, put teeth in that and stop stimulating the proliferation of nuclear weapons, as Kenneth Waltz pointed out, by countries who are going to feel they need them as a deterrent. Yeah, those are all concrete things that we can do to increase our own security.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky.